My name is Damien Leclerc, and what I'm about to tell you is an experience so disturbing that it made me abandon my career in journalism. I never imagined that investigating a secret sect would change my life in the way it did. The horrific revelations I witnessed upon infiltrating a cult that worshipped subterranean reptilian creatures were more than any rational mind could bear. By the 1970s, my life had fallen into a monotonous routine. I worked as a journalist for a prestigious Parisian newspaper, but the passion I had for the profession had faded. Day after day, I found myself stuck in an endless series of trivial reports and everyday news that didn't pique my interest. Every article I wrote was a reminder of the lost spark that once propelled me to pursue this career. I longed for a story that made me feel alive again, an investigation that would not only revive my love of journalism, but also give me purpose. One night, trying to clear my head and drown my frustrations, I went to a bar downtown. The place, shrouded in yellow light and filled with tobacco smoke, was full of people chatting excitedly. I sat in a dark corner, watching the hubbub around me as I slowly drank my whiskey. While drinking, my attention was caught by a conversation at a nearby table. Two men spoke in low voices, but I managed to catch a few words that aroused my curiosity. New religion, Saint Paul de Vie, draconian movement. Curious, I approached surreptitiously. "Next week," said one of them, a nervous-looking man. "My sister says the draconian move could change our lives, but I need money for the trip." The other man laughed loudly, almost spilling his beer. "Are you crazy? A cult? Even if I had money, I wouldn't lend it to you. This sounds like a trap for con artists and fanatics." The nervous man stood up from the table abruptly, knocking over his beer and throwing his chair onto the floor in his fury. The entire bar fell silent as he quickly left. With my journalistic instinct on alert, I decided to follow him. This could be the story I was looking for. I followed the man down several streets, keeping a safe distance. Finally, he realized he was being followed, turned around and, with an angry expression, confronted me. A stranger who probably just wants to make fun of me. I thought quickly. "I will give you money. The money you need for the journey. But you must tell me everything you know about this new religion." The man sighed and extended his hand. "Okay, but let's talk at my house." I got up from the ground and shook his hand, thus sealing the beginning of my adventure into the unknown. He took me to his home, a modest residence on the outskirts of town. As we got closer, I could feel the tension in the air. The man didn't say much during the ride, and I respected his silence. We entered a simple but welcoming living room. The light from a lamp created a warm glow in the room, but it couldn't completely dispel the feeling of restlessness that invaded me. "Marie, we have visitors," the man announced. His wife, a woman with brown hair and a tired face, appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. His smile was kind, but his eyes revealed a deep sadness. "Good evening," I greeted, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "I'm Damien Leclerc, journalist. Your husband invited me to dinner." "Nice to meet you, Damien," Marie replied, although her voice sounded a little forced. "Please have a seat. Dinner will be ready in a moment." We sat around the table and the tension in the air was palpable. The man kept looking at his plate while Marie served the food in silence. I tried to break the ice with some trivia questions, but the answers were brief and blunt. It was then that my eyes fell on a photograph hanging on the kitchen wall. It showed the man and Marie with a little girl of about 8 years old. There was something about that photo that disturbed me, a sense of loss that I couldn't ignore. "Is that your daughter?" I asked, pointing to the photo. Jean-Luc looked up and nodded with an expression full of sadness. And so, between furtive glances and uncomfortable silences, I began to understand that there was much more behind that new religion than it seemed. The pieces of this macabre puzzle were beginning to fit together, and I could barely imagine the horror I was about to discover. Every detail of the conversation, every expression, and every silence contributed to the growing discomfort that took hold of me. I felt like I was about to plunge into a deep, unknown abyss, where dark and terrible truths awaited me. The atmosphere in the house was full of tension and mystery. Marie, even without saying much, seemed to share a secret with her husband, a secret that I was about to reveal. The sense of imminent danger was palpable, and my journalistic instinct told me I was on the right path, even if it meant risking my own sanity. Jean-Luc finally started talking about this new religion. His words were full of hesitation, as if he was fighting something inside himself to not reveal too much. He described clandestine meetings in isolated locations where strange rituals were performed, and mentioned hooded figures leading the ceremonies. Every detail made the picture more frightening, and the curiosity that had initially attracted me to this investigation began to transform into a growing fear. As Jean-Luc spoke, I tried to maintain my composure, but my mind was in turmoil. It was clear that this sect was not just another eccentric popular belief. There was something much deeper and more disturbing involved. The subtly mentioned worship of reptilian creatures sounded like something out of a nightmare, but Jean-Luc's serious and troubled look made me believe he was telling the truth. The night wore on, and I felt like I was just scratching the surface of a mystery that could destroy everything I knew. Even so, a part of me, perhaps the most naive and curious part, wanted to continue, wanted to find out where this story could take me. And so, with a mixture of fear and fascination, I found myself involved in a plot that would end up changing my life forever. I didn't know at that moment that what was coming would cause me to question not only my profession, but also my own sanity. The pieces of this macabre puzzle were just beginning to come together, and what I would soon discover would be nothing short of terrifying. "My name is Emily," he said in a deep voice. "She died a year ago in an accident. A truck ran over her when she went to get her ball from the street. A heavy silence fell over us, and I felt a lump in my throat, knowing I had touched a still open wound. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, sincerely touched. The man nodded and took a sip of his wine before continuing. "Thank you, it has been very difficult for us, and that is why we are so interested in the draconian movement." I leaned forward, intrigued. "How can this new religion help you?" The man took a deep breath and began to explain. "The draconian movement believes in the existence of ancestral beings who have the power to resurrect the dead. According to René Delmar, these beings can bring those who have already left back to life, but it is not cheap. Large donations are needed to finance the rituals and construction of their temple." My thoughts revolved around the idea, which seemed absurd, but the pain in the man and his wife's eyes was real. They clung to this belief desperately. Careful with my words, I tried to sound as empathetic as possible. "I understand how you feel. In fact, I was lucky enough to win a considerable amount in a journalism competition last year. I can help you with the money you need to move to St. Paul de Vie, but there is one condition." The man looked at me suspiciously. "What condition?" "I want to accompany them," I said. "I want to see for myself what this draconian move can do." The man was silent for a moment, pondering my words, and finally nodded slowly. "Okay, we're moving in on Friday. We will give you all the information you need and you can follow us. By the way, my name is Jean-Luc," said the man, shaking my hand. Feeling like I had just sealed a pact with destiny, I had no idea what awaited me in St. Paul de Vie, but I was determined to find out no matter the cost. I returned to my apartment that same night, knowing I had no time to waste. The small room was disorganized with papers and books scattered everywhere. I started packing in a hurry, making sure to pack my camera, recorder, and notebooks. This was more than a simple investigation. It was an opportunity to do something meaningful with my career. The next day I showed up early at the newspaper office. My boss, a burly middle-aged man with a bushy beard, looked up when I entered. "Damien, what brings you here so early?" he asked, clearly surprised to see me. I sat across from him, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I'm going to need a few days off, boss. I have a lead on a story that could be the big scoop we've been waiting for." I briefly explained my plan to go to St. Paul de Vie and document the draconian movement sect. His expression changed from surprise to concern. "Are you sure about this, Damien? It looks dangerous." I nodded with determination. "Yes, I have. This is the opportunity I've been looking for. I promise I will bring you a report that will be worth it." Finally, he gave in, albeit with some reluctance. "Okay, but be careful and stay in touch. I want to know that you are okay." With that, I left the office, ready to venture into the unknown. On Friday morning, I went to Jean-Luc's house. When I arrived, they were already waiting at the front with their bags. An old, dusty car was parked in front of the house, with Jean-Luc at the wheel. "Damien, this is Pierre," said Jean-Luc, introducing us. "Pierre, this is Damien, the journalist I told you about." Pierre greeted me with a tight smile, and we quickly loaded our things into the car. The journey began in silence, with the car engine roaring gently as we drove away from the city. As we drove along the road, Pierre handed me a small book with worn covers. "Read this," he said, keeping his eyes on the path. "This will give you an idea of what we are getting into." I opened the book and started reading. It was a kind of manifesto written by René Dalmar, the leader of the Draconian movement. He described his encounter with saurian creatures in an underground cave, and how he received a divine revelation that led him to form the cult. According to René, many years ago, during an exploration in some caves, he became separated from his group, hypnotized by a voice calling him from the darkness. René began walking through the dark tunnels. Unfortunately, he tripped and fell into a deep hole filled with sharp rocks, which shattered his bones and pierced his flesh. He felt horrible pain, and was sure he was going to die. Little by little, he felt his body closing down and accepted his death. But after a while, he opened his eyes again. Air filled his lungs again, and slowly he felt his body again. He looked around and was in a large underground cave, lit by torches. While examining his body, which was unharmed after the big fall, some figures emerged from the darkness. René described them as our scaly brothers, the saurians. Most of them measured around 2.80 meters in height. Although there were individuals of larger and smaller stature, they had 5 webbed fingers on their hands and feet, as well as an extra retractable nail, similar to that of cats, but harder and suitable for combat. Its skin, covered in scales, appeared to be permanently moist and was green-brown in color. Some of them had blue-green plumage on their chests, indicating high lineages or ruling castes. His skin turned red in the ventral region, where it was possible to observe his lymphatic and blood system. These beings introduced themselves to René, saying that the Great Patriarch gave him back his life and allowed him to continue his mission on Earth. René said that the saurians instructed him to return to the human world and start a movement to prepare humanity for the return of these ancient creatures. He described complex rituals and ceremonies that involved chanting and sacrifices, with the aim of gathering enough energy for the resurrection of the dead. The manifesto detailed the foundations of the Draconian religion and the rules that its followers must observe to achieve salvation and the return of those they lost. As I read, I felt a mixture of fascination and repulsion. The idea that these creatures could actually exist and exercise some kind of power over life and death seemed far-fetched, but the conviction with which René wrote and the way Jean-Luc and Pierre were dedicated to this movement made me question my own beliefs. I wondered how far these rituals could really go, and what we would find in St. Paul de Vie. The ride continued in silence, except for the sound of the engine and the occasional sound of pages turning as I read. Jean-Luc and Pierre seemed absorbed in their own thoughts, perhaps reflecting on what was to come, and I, with the book in hand, felt that I was about to dive into a dark and unknown world, where the boundaries between reality and the supernatural were blurred, and where the promise of resurrection could lead to unimaginable consequences. With every word I read, it became clearer that this was not just an ordinary investigation. It was something that touched people's deepest fears and most desperate desires, something that could transform lives or destroy them, and I was determined to find out what was really hiding behind this draconian move, even if it meant facing my own demons. René Dalmar wrote in his book that he had an important mission given to him by an ancient race to help restore the reign of these creatures on Earth. These beings claimed to have a glorious and imperial past, but it was now in decline. René accepted his fate and claimed to have met the Great Patriarch, a powerful entity. According to him, anyone could do the same, but there were certain requirements to join the movement, including the need to raise funds to build a new temple. This temple would be the place where the Great Patriarch could emerge from his underground kingdom and rule over the earth. I spent most of the trip reading this book and writing it down in my notebook. The more I read, the more my distrust grew. The descriptions were so detailed and extravagant that it was difficult to believe them. Furthermore, the fact that large amounts of money were needed for the rituals made me think that this could all be a big scam, targeting vulnerable people. Marie, who was sitting behind me, noticed my worried expression and gently asked, "Is everything okay, Damien?" I nodded, closing the book and replying, "Yeah, I'm just trying to process all of this." Pierre, who was driving, let out a bitter laugh and commented, "I understand. At first I thought it was crazy too. But when you're desperate, you cling to anything that offers a spark of hope." I looked out the window, watching the landscape change as we drove away from the city. Beneath the tranquil surface, this place seemed to hide ancient secrets. After 4 days of travel, we finally arrived at an isolated farm on the outskirts of St. Paul de Vie. The dirt road kicked up clouds of dust as we approached. When we arrived, Jean-Luc's older sister came out to welcome us. She was a robust woman with a friendly laugh, but she couldn't hide her surprise at seeing a stranger among the visitors. "Welcome," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Claire," Jean-Luc introduced her. "Claire, this is Damien Leclerc, the journalist I told you about. Without his financial help, we wouldn't be here." Claire nodded, although she still looked a little suspicious. "I understand, Damien. I just ask that you respect our lifestyle here in the village. Please don't say anything offensive or out of place." I returned the smile, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry, Claire. I'm just looking for some spiritual guidance." She seemed to calm down with my response and said, more relaxed, "Excellent, come, I'll show you your rooms." As soon as we entered the large house, I noticed something disturbing. The walls were filled with photographs of a man wearing a white robe. I counted at least 20 photos, all showing René Delmar in different poses and moments. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how much these people worshipped their leader. "Is that him, René Delmar?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," Claire replied proudly. "He is our leader and spiritual guide. Thanks to him, we have hope." I tried to hide my discomfort as they showed me my room. The room was simple, but cozy, with a small bed and a desk. That night we got together for dinner. Claire gave a little speech at the table, welcoming us to her home. "Tomorrow will be a big day," she said excitedly. "You will be able to hear the leader in the village chapel. But for now, I invite everyone to join hands and raise a prayer to the Grand Patriarch." We all held hands, and Claire began to pray in a strange language that I couldn't understand. I tilted my head, trying to hide my confusion. "O Great Patriarch, allow our loved ones to return to life." "Amen," Claire concluded. "Amen." We all responded in unison. The food served that night was strange, with flavors and textures I had never tasted before. Claire assured us that it was a special diet, designed to keep the body healthy and free of harmful substances. After dinner, while the women were clearing the table, Jean-Luc motioned for me to come out of the house with him. We walked a little under the starry sky. "You heard my sister," Jean-Luc said in a serious voice. "Tomorrow we will attend the leader's mass. Claire got him to take my case after the mass, but I will need the money you promised." I nodded. "It's ready in a fabric bag in my room. I'll leave it in front of your door tonight." Jean-Luc looked at me gratefully and extended his hand. "Thank you, Damien. It means a lot to us." As he walked away to return to the house, I couldn't help but ask, "Jean-Luc, what exactly can this leader do for you?" He stopped, swallowed hard before replying, "He's going to resurrect my little daughter." A chill ran down my spine as I watched Jean-Luc walk away. The hopelessness and pain that led him to believe something so unbelievable was palpable. But now I was involved, and I needed to keep going to find out the truth. I decided to take a walk around the property, hoping the fresh air would clear my thoughts. I walked around the farm, observing the stillness of the field in the moonlight. As I wandered, I came to a large, old barn, locked with 3 large padlocks. Curious about what they could be protecting so safely, I approached the barn's locks. As I investigated, I heard a faint sound, like the clinking of chains, and my heart began to beat faster. I found a small opening between the wooden planks and put my eye close to peer. What I saw left me frozen with fear. Inside the barn, at least 10 people were chained in the stables where the horses would normally be. They seemed to feed wildly, almost like animals. The low light made it difficult to see, but enough to realize that something was very wrong. My mind struggled to understand what I had just witnessed. Still in shock, I walked toward the barn entrance, wondering if I should try opening the locks when I suddenly felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I quickly turned around and came across Claire, who was staring at me intently. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice colder than I expected. "Lying," I tried to remain calm. "I got lost in the darkness." Claire continued to look at me for a moment before finally nodding. "Come, I'll show you the way back to the house. This is not a safe place to walk at night." As we walked back, my curiosity got stronger and I couldn't help myself. "What's inside the barn?" I asked. Claire stopped and looked me straight in the eye, before responding with frightening coldness, "That's not a barn, that's my family's room." A shiver ran down my spine at the calm, collected way she said it. When we got to my room, my mind was racing, trying to process what I had seen and heard. I took out my notebook and started writing down everything from the chained people to Claire's strange explanation. Something very dark was happening there. I wrote, "These people are beyond disturbed. They are trapped in a cult that goes beyond what I could imagine. René Delmar's photographs. the family's blind devotion, and now the people chained in the barn, all pointed to something much deeper and more sinister than it seemed. The next morning, the house was buzzing with activity. Claire and Marie told us that we should dress completely in white for Mass. They explained that the clothing symbolized purity. "Today is an important day," Claire said, as she helped us prepare our clothes. "René Delmar will give a special Mass and then he will attend to my brother's case." I watched Jean-Luc as he prepared himself, noticing a mix of hope and anxiety on his face. For him, this was the moment he had been waiting for. But for me, it was an opportunity to discover more about this cult and its dark secrets. We walked together to the village, and the environment was as disturbing and strange as the farm. Most of the residents were gathered in a public square, all dressed in white and singing a strange song that echoed throughout the village. We joined them, and soon a chapel bell began to ring, calling everyone to enter. We headed to the chapel, which was still under construction. Despite this, the interior was meticulously maintained, almost like a small palace. The walls were adorned with figures of creatures that looked like amphibians or reptiles, and on the ceiling was a figure of a much larger creature, surrounded by figures that seemed to worship it. "That's the all-powerful leader who will soon come out to rule the earth," Claire whispered, pointing to the figure on the ceiling. We sat in the pews, and the rhythmic sound of drums filled the chapel, announcing the arrival of René Delmar. Everyone stood up and welcomed him with enthusiastic applause. René, an imposing-looking man, wore a white robe. He raised his hands for silence and began speaking into the microphone. "Brothers and sisters," René began, his voice filling every corner of the chapel, "today is a holy day. We gather to honor the Grand Patriarch and our Saurian brothers." René continued his sermon, telling how he met the Saurian race and the miracles that these beings performed in his life. He talked about how they would soon rise to the surface to rule the earth, as they did in ancient times. Every word was charged with fervor and conviction, but in order for this process to be completed, he paused. "We need money, a lot of money. For Saurians, money has no value, but our society is built on it. Therefore, I ask that you deposit your money in these urns for the construction of the final temple, which will be the home of the great patriarch. I promise you that once he rules the earth and destroys the corrupt leaders, money will no longer have value. He will eliminate money." I watched in amazement as people stood up and deposited large amounts of money into the ballot boxes. René watched each urn filling up and smiled with satisfaction. I couldn't believe how blind these people were to all of this. After almost 3 hours of Mass, everything was about to end. René told everyone to prepare for the conclusion of the ceremony. After the sermon, René Delmar instructed the faithful to form lines as they would soon receive what he called the blood and flesh of the true God. People obeyed, forming 5 distinct lines, and I joined one of them, watching with curiosity and growing discomfort as the faithful received pieces of what appeared to be scales in their mouths and drank from a cup containing a greenish substance. When it was my turn, I took a piece of scale and a cup. The smell was terrible, and I had to control myself not to vomit. The scale had a metallic taste and the greenish substance burned slightly as it went down my throat. I immediately felt nauseous and my vision began to blur. I quickly left the chapel in search of fresh air. I leaned against a tree trying to compose myself as the horror of what I had just witnessed hit me hard. These people were willing to do anything for their faith, and I was in the middle of it all, documenting something I could barely understand. After about 15 minutes, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I saw Jean-Luc accompanied by his wife Marie and leader René Delmar. I remained silent for a few seconds before extending my hand to René. "I'm told you're looking for spiritual help, my brother," René said, shaking my hand. Trying to play along, I replied, "Yes, leader. I'm looking for something to revive my faith." René looked at me with a smile and said, "Excellent, you are lucky today. Come with us, please." I asked where we were going and René replied, "To witness a miracle. Let's all go." We followed René, accompanied by other followers who wore red robes and carried torches to light the way. To my surprise, the path took us to an extensive tunnel that seemed to run through the entire underground part of the village. We walked for about 30 minutes while people in red robes sang a terrifying song. I noticed that the last 2 people in the group were carrying something strange. Finally, we arrived at what appeared to be a large underground chamber, a huge cave. René announced loudly, "We're here." Torches on the walls lit up, revealing a brighter scene. Indeed, we were in a large cave, surrounded by black hooded figures. One of these figures approached Renee and shook his hand. I was horrified to realize that that hand was covered in scales and had claws. "Welcome, brothers. I am Zorax, the guardian of this cave. Your leader has informed me that you are here seeking a miracle," said the hooded figure. Renee then explained, "Yes, they are here to bring a loved one back to life. They have already contributed to the construction of the temple with a monetary donation." Zorax removed his hood, revealing a reptilian face covered in scales, with almond-shaped yellow eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. "Thank you for your cooperation. Now please indicate who you wish to bring back to life," Zorax said in a deep voice. Jean-Luc, overcome with emotion, replied, "She is my little daughter. She is everything to me. Please bring her back." "Very well, brothers. Bring the girl's body here. Remove her from her coffin," Zorax ordered. I was horrified to discover that they had brought little Emily's corpse, hidden in the car from town in a coffin. The seriousness of illegally exhuming a body became evident at that moment. The men in red robes did as ordered, bringing the small coffin in front of us all and slamming it open. A horrible smell of decay and death spread, causing everyone to step back, coughing and covering their noses. René raised his voice above the tumult. "Calm down, brothers. The smell of death is only temporary. We will be witnesses to a miracle of life." René Delmar paused, allowing silence to reign in the cave again. "Let the girl's mother come closer and stand on my right side. She will be fundamental to the miracle," ordered René. Marie, Jean-Luc's wife, obeyed, although her steps were hesitant. She positioned herself next to René, who began his ritual. "O mighty great patriarch, you who gave me back my life, I beg you now to help this child recover his vital energy. Bring him back from the dead. Your faithful have already contributed for the construction of your temple, which will soon be ready for your government. We beseech you, great patriarch, come here and honor us with your presence." Everyone remained completely silent as the men in red robes approached the corpse in the coffin, torches in hand. Suddenly, something like a tentacle wrapped around the coffin and began to drag it into the darkness. Men with torches followed, illuminating the macabre scene. The tentacle belonged to a much larger, grotesque and bizarre creature that hid in the darkness. It was the Grand Patriarch, a beast covered in scales with a large crocodile-like head full of horrible teeth. With the help of its tentacle, the creature dragged the girl's body to its mouth and devoured her. The sound of the bones breaking in his jaw was frightening. Soon after, a strange movement was noticed in the creature's belly, as if something was happening inside it. The Grand Patriarch's eyes began to glow an intense orange hue, while his body began to contort in a strange manner. René Delmar, the leader, looked at Marie and said, "Now it is time for the girl's mother to approach the Grand Patriarch." Marie began to slowly walk towards the creature, her face reflecting a mix of fear and hope. Suddenly, another tentacle, this time black, emerged from the Grand Patriarch's body and wrapped itself around Marie, causing her indescribable suffering. The scene was brutal and lasted at least a minute, until the tentacle finally released her, leaving her exhausted on the ground. René then proclaimed, "It is done. The Patriarch has brought the girl back to life. It is a miracle." Meanwhile, Marie began to writhe on the floor and her abdomen began to swell rapidly, as if she were 9 months pregnant. "Brothers, let's help this woman give birth," said René. Jean-Luc knelt beside his wife and begged, "Let me help with the birth." René nodded. "Okay, let the father help." For 3 minutes, Marie had intense contractions, and I watched in disbelief at what was happening. It seemed like the miracle of life was real. With one last effort, Marie gave birth to a creature that was definitely not human. It was something like a baby, but with scales, yellow eyes, small claws at the ends, and a mouth full of teeth. Jean-Luc took the creature in his arms and exclaimed, "My God, she is as beautiful as I remember." I was horrified by that terrible scene. Marie, exhausted by childbirth, asked to see her daughter, or rather, that half-reptilian aberration. Jean-Luc obeyed and brought the creature closer to his face. Suddenly, the newborn lunged at Marie's face, tearing off a piece of skin. Marie screamed in terror, while René shouted, "The little one is hungry. Be careful. Don't leave her near her mother, or she may devour her whole. Bring the man who will be sacrificed for food." At that moment, all the red-cloaked men turned to me. It was then that I realized that I was the sacrifice. They had not taken me to that cave to witness a miracle, but rather to be food for the newborn creature. Adrenaline took over me. I took a torch from the wall and hit one of the hooded men blocking my exit, setting his tunic on fire. I took advantage of the confusion to start running desperately through the tunnel where we had arrived. My feet hit the rocky ground hard, and my breathing became increasingly heavy. There was no time to think, only to run away. After what seemed like an interminable 15 minutes, I finally reached the door that led to the outside of the chapel. However, my hopes were quickly dashed when I realized that the door was locked and reinforced with chains. I knocked on the door with all my strength, but it was in vain. Despair began to overwhelm me. In a last desperate effort, I shouted, "The leader needs help! He's hurt! Open! Open!" My words echoed through the tunnel, and I heard footsteps approaching. My heart skipped a beat when 2 SECT members dressed in red robes arrived at the door and, with worried expressions, quickly opened it. "Where is he?" asked one of them, looking towards the tunnel. "Down there in the cave," I said, pointing urgently into the darkness. Without thinking twice, the guards ran towards the cave. I took advantage of the moment and slipped through the door, feeling the fresh air hit my face. I didn't look back. I ran with all my strength, getting as far away from that village as possible. I kept running until my legs couldn't take it anymore. The road stretched out before me, lonely and deserted. I walked for almost a whole day, the sun burning my back and fatigue taking over my body. Finally, my strength left me and I collapsed to the floor, exhausted. It was at that moment that a group of cyclists appeared in the distance. They stopped quickly upon seeing my condition, and one of them knelt down beside me, offering me water. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "I need help. SECT, Zrenia," was all I could say before losing consciousness. One of the cyclists quickly cycled to the next village to ask for help. I felt my consciousness slipping away, but I knew that for now I was safe. I remember that after another 2 hours, an ambulance arrived and took me to the village, where I was hospitalized. Upon arriving at the hospital, I asked to speak to a police officer to report the SECT. Shortly afterwards, a police officer approached my room, notebook in hand, ready to take down my complaint. Although his expression showed incredulity at what I was telling him, he promised me that they would check the area. "That's an incredible story, Mr. Leclerc," said Officer Dubois, "but we'll check the area." A few days later, the newspaper where I worked sent a colleague to pick me up by car after I managed to reach them by phone. Regarding my report to the police, Officer Dubois informed me that they did not have the jurisdiction to go to that village and arrest someone. "You would have to go and report it to this village," the officer explained. "Without a formal complaint in the locality, we cannot act." My frustration was evident. "I'm not going back to that place even if I'm dead," I replied angrily as I headed for the door. I left the police station and got into my friend's car. The ride back to the city was silent. When I arrived at the newspaper office, my boss was eager to hear the big story I had promised. "What do you have, Damien?" he asked expectantly. I looked at him, feeling the weight of my decision. "I can't publish this," he finally said. "It's too dangerous." My boss looked at me in surprise. "Are you sure? This could be the story of your career." I nodded slowly. "I know, but there are things it's better not to reveal." The years passed and the memories of those dark days never left me. Now, in my old age, I decided it was time to tell my story, even if it was just in my memoirs. If you are reading this, be careful. The reptilian creatures are still around and their plans to rule the earth have not changed. Protect yourself and protect those you love, because true horror may be closer than you think. After so many years of keeping this secret, I finally let the words flow. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, but the need to share what I experienced was stronger than any doubt. The weight of that experience never left me. He was present in every step I took, in every decision I made. Even now, as I write these lines, I feel the oppressive presence of what I witnessed, as if the shadows of that place were still watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I still clearly remember every detail: the suffocating humidity of the cave, the putrid smell that filled the air, the sinister gleam in the Grand Patriarch's eyes. To this day, these flashes of memory haunt me, invading my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart beating frantically, as if I'm back in that dark tunnel, running for my life. After my escape, I thought I could leave all this behind, but I was wrong. The horror I witnessed in that village has never really left me. Each night when I close my eyes, I am taken back to that cave, to Marie's screams, to the sound of bones being crunched in the creature's jaw. And no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that it didn't end there. The years have passed, but the feeling of being watched, followed by something I cannot see, persists. Every now and then I feel a chill run down my spine, a feeling that there is something lurking in the shadows. And although I try to convince myself that these are just old memories, something inside me knows there is more. That's why, a few months ago, I decided to return to the village. Not as the reporter hungry for a story, but as someone who needed answers. I spent weeks trying to track down information about St. Paul de Vie, but the place seemed to have disappeared from the map. Every attempt to locate the village ended in dead ends. Old maps didn't show it, and the few records I found were vague, as if the place had never existed. I decided the only way to find out the truth was to go there on my own. I got in the car and headed in the direction where, in my memory, the village should be. The road seemed to stretch infinitely in front of me, lined with ancient trees whose tops formed a kind of natural tunnel. The sun was setting when I finally saw the entrance to the village, marked by an old rusty sign that could barely read, St. Paul de Vie. The village was exactly as I remembered, small, silent, with an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hold back the air around it. The houses, old and worn out by time, seemed uninhabited. There was no sign of life. What had once been a busy square was now deserted, covered in dry leaves and surrounded by stone statues that seemed to be watching me. Every step I took was accompanied by the crushing sound of silence. I walked to the place where the chapel was supposed to be. It was there, but in ruins, as if it had been abandoned decades ago. The walls were covered in moss and the ceiling had collapsed in several parts, letting in the dusk light in beams that partially illuminated the dark interior. In the center, where the altar used to be, there was now just a hole, a void that seemed to swallow the light. The place seemed even more sinister than I remembered. With a tightness in my chest, I entered the chapel. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the musty smell permeated the air. I walked toward the hole in the ground, each step more difficult than the last, as if something was trying to stop me from continuing. When I finally reached the edge of the hole, I saw that it went deep down, like a well that seemed to have no end. I took a flashlight and shined it into the hole, but the light couldn't reach the bottom. I felt a cold breeze rising from the depths, and at that moment, a low, guttural sound echoed from the shadows. My heart raced. It was the same sound I heard years ago in the cave where the Grand Patriarch revealed himself. That sound was enough to make me flinch, panic rising inside me. But before I could move, something moved at the bottom of the hole. It was a shadow, or at least it seemed to be. It was something that writhed, molded, and changed shape, as if it were alive. My body froze as I tried to understand what I was seeing, and then suddenly the darkness seemed to rise, as if it had a life of its own. The shadow advanced towards me, and with it, the same cold that I felt in that cave. I knew I couldn't stay there. Turning on my heel, I ran out of the chapel, the guttural sound now louder, closer. As soon as I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me hard, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the key to start the engine. When I finally made it, I sped away from that place, without looking back. As I drove back to the city, one thought kept repeating in my mind. The village, the sect, the Grand Patriarch, all of it still existed, buried beneath layers of time and silence. And if that were true, what else was hidden? I knew that somehow it was still lurking, waiting. And as I write these memoirs, I can't help but feel that this story isn't over yet. Something tells me that one day, the horror will return to the surface, and perhaps next time, there will be no escape. With every kilometer that I walked away from that village, I felt the weight of something dark and old gradually dissipate. It was as if the darkness that enveloped St. Paul de Vie was trying to pull me back. But the force of the outside world was finally beginning to free me. Still, memories of the horrors I witnessed remained etched in my mind, each detail more vivid and terrifying than the last. The way back to the city was long and silent. The sound of the engine was the only company as my mind revisited every moment of that sinister journey. The vision of the Grand Patriarch, the reptilian creature who controlled those blind followers, continued to haunt me. The scene of Marie being used as a means to give birth to a non-human aberration, and the horror of realizing that I was the next to be sacrificed, were memories I knew I would never be able to erase. When I finally arrived in the city, the reality of everyday life hit me hard. The bright lights, chaotic traffic, and people going about their lives seemed so far removed from the nightmare I had just experienced. I parked the car in front of my building and stood there, trying to find the courage to leave. My body was still shaking and my thoughts were in disarray. It was like the village was trying to keep a piece of me trapped there. I went up to my apartment, closing the door carefully, as if that could protect me from the shadows that I felt were still lurking around me. The silence in the apartment was comforting, but it also made me feel vulnerable. All I wanted was to forget, but I knew forgetting wasn't an option. I decided I needed to get it all down on paper as a last-ditch effort to exorcise these demons from my mind. In the days that followed, I isolated myself from the world. I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and started writing. Every word was an effort to make sense of the chaos he had experienced. The story, which began as a journalistic investigation, had turned into something much darker and more personal. With each sentence written, I felt like I was reliving it all over again. The fear, the adrenaline, the despair. Finally, after endless days of writing, I realized that I had reached the end of my narrative. I had unearthed everything, every horrible detail, every shadow that haunted me. The weight on my shoulders eased a little, but there was still a part of me that knew this story would never truly be finished. Something inside me whispered that the Grand Patriarch and his followers were still out there waiting. Now, as I share this story, I want to leave a message for you who are reading or listening to these words. There are forces in the world we cannot fully understand. Horrors hidden in the shadows that few dare face. It's easy to ignore these signs, pretend they don't exist. But as I learned the hard way, the real danger lies in not being prepared. If you liked this story, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your opinion in the comments. I would like to know what you thought of this narrative and what you learned from it. Your comments are very important and help me continue to bring you stories like this. And if you've had a supernatural experience or know someone who has, don't hesitate to share in the comments. Who knows, this might help other people understand that true horror may be closer than we think. And remember, protecting those we love and preparing for the unknown may be the only defense we have against forces we don't understand. What happened in St. Paul de Vie is just one of the many stories that are out there, waiting to be discovered. Never forget that evil can be lurking where we least expect it. And if you ever come across the inexplicable, remember the words of this old journalist: run, don't look back, and never underestimate the power of the shadows. Thank you very much for watching this far, and don't forget to activate the bell to receive notifications of upcoming stories. Until next time, and may you always be prepared for whatever is lurking in the darkness.